The American guard was eating an orange and grinning at me. Corporal Thomas Hayes sat across from me in the back of that army truck, juice running down his chin, and he said four words that made absolutely no sense. "We're going swimming." I stared at him. 24 years old, 3 weeks a prisoner of war, and this Iowa farmer turned soldier was telling me we were going swimming. In the middle of a war, in the middle of captivity. The mathematics made no sense whatsoever. Through the canvas opening at the back of the truck, I watched palm trees rushing past. Florida. I was in Florida. The heat was thick and wet, nothing like the dry furnace of North Africa where I'd spent the last 18 months. Nothing like the cold that must be settling over Munich right now. My mother would be preparing for winter rationing coal, probably wondering if I was still alive. I hadn't been able to write her yet. The letters took months to cross the Atlantic, and even then they were censored so heavily that nothing real could be said. Hayes kept grinning. He was 42, too old for combat duty with a bad knee that kept him stateside. He'd told me this a week ago during lunch break at the orange groves where we worked. Told me in broken German while offering me a cigarette. His grandparents had come from Bavaria before the First War, a small town called Rosenheim that I'd never heard of. But it didn't matter. That conversation had been the strangest 15 minutes of my life. Small talk between enemies, a German prisoner and an American guard discussing family history while sitting under an oak tree in the Florida heat. The truck hit a bump and I grabbed the wooden bench to steady myself. 11 other prisoners sat with me. Most of them were quiet, staring at nothing, trying to understand what was happening. Otto Brandt sat beside me. He was 38, a sergeant before capture, and he'd been at Camp Blanding 2 months longer than me. Otto had told me about the swimming trips. He'd said the Americans sometimes let prisoners swim in nearby lakes on weekends. Supervised recreation. 2 hours in the water, then back to camp. I hadn't believed him. It sounded like the kind of story prisoners tell each other to maintain hope. A fantasy to break the monotony of confinement. But here we were. June 18th, 1943. 2:47 in the afternoon, according to the watch Hayes wore, and we were heading west from Camp Blanding towards something called Lake Geneva. 3 weeks earlier, I'd expected to die. May 12th, Tunisia. My unit, the 21st Panzer Division, had been surrounded for 3 days. No food, no ammunition, no hope of relief. We sat in our positions outside Enfidaville, watching British tanks roll toward us across the dusty plain. 140 men in my company. Most of us too exhausted to feel fear anymore, just waiting for it to end. When the British came through, we walked out with our hands raised. I dropped my Kar 98K rifle in the sand. Last time I held it as a soldier. The weight of it leaving my hands felt like something dying inside me. 5 years of training, 3 years of service, 18 months in the desert fighting an enemy we could never quite defeat. And it ended with me dropping my rifle and raising my hands while a British sergeant shouted instructions in English I barely understood. They were correct, though. The British. They fed us, gave us water, processed us through a collection point where thousands of German and Italian soldiers sat in wire enclosures waiting for transport. I spent 9 days at that collection point, 9 days of sitting in the sun eating British rations, watching Italian prisoners cry while German prisoners sat in silence. We didn't cry. We just waited. The propaganda films we'd seen during training had shown us what to expect if we were captured. Dark cells, interrogations, starvation rations, men beaten until they gave up intelligence, men shot for minor infractions. The British hadn't done any of that. They'd been professional, almost bored, processing us like factory workers sorting parts. Name, rank, serial number, photograph, fingerprints, move along. Then the ship, a Liberty ship bound for America. 17 days crossing the Atlantic with 800 German prisoners packed into the cargo holds. The conditions weren't brutal, but they weren't comfortable either. Too many men in too little space. The smell of unwashed bodies. Seasickness that left me retching into a bucket for the first week. The constant fear that a U-boat might torpedo us without knowing Germans were aboard. our own submarines killing us because they couldn't see the prisoner markings. I lost 14 pounds on that voyage. I could feel my ribs through my shirt by the time we docked at Norfolk, Virginia on June 9th. When American military police marched us off that ship onto solid ground, I could barely walk straight. My legs had forgotten what stable earth felt like. And then the shock. The first shock of many. The MP sergeant who processed us was a black man. He spoke perfect German. "Willkommen in America," he said. "Welcome to America." His accent was flawless. Better than mine, probably. The propaganda had told us Americans were inferior, culturally weak, racially mixed and therefore degraded. But this man stood in front of me in a crisp uniform with sergeant stripes and spoke my language better than I spoke his. He handed me a sandwich, white bread, real meat, some kind of ham, I think. I ate it standing there on the dock while he processed my paperwork. First real meat I'd tasted in 6 months. The trains took us south, through Virginia, through the Carolinas, into Georgia, finally into Florida. The landscape changed as we traveled. Pine forests gave way to swamps, then flatlands covered in sand and scrub palmetto. The heat intensified. By the time we reached Camp Blanding on June 11th, I understood I was somewhere tropical, somewhere nothing like Germany, somewhere I would probably remain for the duration of the war, however long that lasted. Camp Blanding sat on 170,000 acres of land northeast of a town called Stark. The base had been built in 1939 as a training facility for American infantry divisions. By 1943, it also housed German prisoners of war. We were processed through the POW compound on the western edge of the base. Photographed again, fingerprinted again, issued clean uniforms. American field jackets dyed with large PW markings on the back, canvas shoes, 2 blankets, a mess kit. We were assigned to barracks, wooden structures with screened windows and tin roofs. 20 men per barracks. Each man received a cot, a footlocker, and a small shelf. I'd expected concrete cells, guard towers with searchlights, dogs, barbed wire and brutality. Instead, I found something that looked like a summer camp. The barracks were clean. The latrines had running water. The mess hall served hot food 3 times a day. That first night at Camp Blanding, I ate beef stew, real beef, white bread, canned peaches, real coffee, more food than I'd seen in the last 6 months of fighting in North Africa. I sat at a long table with other prisoners and tried to understand what kind of prison gave its inmates beef stew and coffee. Otto sat across from me. He'd been at Blanding 2 months already, captured in Libya back in April. He explained the situation while eating his stew with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd learned not to waste anything. America had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners of war receive the same quality of food, housing, and medical care as the capturing nation's own troops. America was following the rules. We would work, but we would be paid 80 cents per day in camp script that could be spent at the canteen. We would work 8-hour days with rest periods. We would receive adequate food and clothing. We would not be beaten or tortured or executed. Otto said all of this in a matter-of-fact tone while eating his beef stew, and I realized he was telling the truth. This was not propaganda. This was policy. The Americans were actually following the Geneva Convention. They were treating us the way they treated their own soldiers. Not because they had to, not because anyone was watching, but because their system said they should. I couldn't reconcile this with what I'd been told, that Americans were weak, that they had no culture and no honor, that they would torture prisoners and laugh while doing it. But the evidence sat in front of me. Hot food, clean bunks, running water, guards who spoke without screaming. That night I lay on my cot and stared at the tin roof of the barracks. Outside I could hear insects, strange Florida insects that made sounds I'd never heard in Germany. Someone was playing a harmonica in another barracks. A German song, something from before the war. The music drifted through the screens, and I felt something crack inside me. Not breaking, just cracking, like ice in spring. But there was darkness too. Not all prisoners accepted this mercy. Werner Vogel lay in a bunk 3 down from mine, 32 years old, SS affiliated before being transferred to the Wehrmacht for the Africa campaign. Werner had cold eyes and a rigid spine. He sat up that first night and looked at the rest of us eating our stew, and he said something I'd never forget. "Don't trust this. They're softening us, making us weak. When they interrogate us, we'll be easier to break. And when Germany wins this war, every man who cooperated will hang as a collaborator." The barracks went quiet. Werner's voice had that effect. It carried authority, even though he had no rank here. We were all just prisoners, but some men carry the ideology in their bones. Werner was one of them. He believed Germany would win. He believed this mercy was a trick. He believed cooperation was treason. Otto put down his spoon. He looked at Werner with the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too much to believe in simple stories anymore. "Germany isn't winning, Werner. Open your eyes. Look at the maps. Look at the numbers. We're fighting on 3 fronts against enemies with superior industry and unlimited resources. This war is already over. We just haven't admitted it yet." Werner stood up. For a moment I thought he'd attack Otto right there, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, but the guards were watching through the windows. Werner sat back down. He didn't speak again that night. But I saw the hatred in his eyes. Not hatred for the Americans, hatred for us. For men like Otto and me who could see the truth and weren't afraid to say it. That was my first night at Camp Blanding. Beef stew and the realization that I'd be spending this war among men divided by more than just barbed wire. Some of us wanted to survive. Some of us wanted to remain pure. And those two desires were about to collide. The work began on June 14th. 50 prisoners loaded into trucks and driven 20 miles west to citrus groves that stretched for miles. Endless rows of orange trees heavy with fruit. The foreman was a civilian named Henry Patterson, 55 years old, weathered skin from a lifetime in the Florida sun. He explained the job through an interpreter. Each prisoner would be assigned 30 boxes to fill. Each box held up to 100 pounds of oranges. Pick the fruit carefully. Don't bruise it. Stack the full boxes at the end of each row. Work hours were 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon with a 1-hour break for lunch. Once a prisoner filled his 30 boxes, he was done for the day. If he finished early, he could rest in the shade. Patterson made it clear that working fast benefited the prisoners, not just the growers. The sooner you finish, the sooner you rest. Simple economics. Motivation without cruelty. I started picking at 8:15 that first morning. The work was simple but physically demanding. Reach up, grab an orange, twist and pull. Place it gently in the canvas bag hanging from my shoulder. When the bag was full, empty it into a wooden box. Repeat. The Florida sun was brutal. By 9 o'clock my shirt was soaked with sweat. By 10 my shoulders ached from reaching overhead. By 11 I understood why Patterson had said speed mattered. The faster I worked, the sooner I could stop. I filled my first box by 9:30, second box by 10:45. I was getting faster as I learned the rhythm. Pick, twist, pull, place. Don't think about it, just move. By noon, I'd filled 9 boxes. The lunch break came at 12. The prisoners sat in the shade of a large oak tree near the packing shed. The guards distributed sandwiches, bread with cheese and some kind of meat I couldn't identify. Ham, maybe. They also distributed oranges, as many oranges as the prisoners wanted to eat. I ate 2 sandwiches and 3 oranges. I drank water from a canteen the guards refilled from a pump near the shed. Then I sat with my back against the oak tree and watched American guards sitting nearby eating the same sandwiches and oranges. One of the guards sat apart from the others. Private Jack Sullivan, 19 years old. He'd been assigned to our detail 3 days ago. Sullivan never spoke to the prisoners. He just watched us with eyes that held something cold and hard. Not hatred exactly. Something deeper. Grief, maybe. The kind that turns into stone. Hayes sat closer. He finished his sandwich and pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes. He offered me one. American tobacco. I took it. We smoked in silence for a few minutes before Hayes asked in his broken German where I was from. Munich, I said. Hayes nodded, said his grandparents had come from Bavaria before the First War. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. Small talk, families, weather, crops, the kind of conversation you might have with a neighbor over a fence, except he was my guard and I was his prisoner, and somewhere across the ocean men wearing our respective uniforms were killing each other by the thousands. I couldn't reconcile this. The propaganda had told me Americans were cruel, that they had no culture, that they were weak and soft and would collapse under pressure. But Hayes was just a man from Iowa who missed his family and wanted the war to end so he could go home and work his farm. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't weak. He was just tired. Like me. Sullivan kept watching from 20 feet away. Never came closer, never spoke, just watched with those stone eyes. I didn't know it then, but Sullivan's choice not to hate me would save my sanity 3 months later, when Werner's hatred finally exploded into violence. I resumed picking at 1 o'clock, filled my remaining 21 boxes by 4:20 in the afternoon, 40 minutes early. I stacked the last box at the end of my row and walked to the packing shed to report completion. Patterson checked the boxes, counted them, marked my name on a clipboard. I was done. I sat under the oak tree with 7 other prisoners who'd also finished and waited for the truck to take us back to camp. That evening in the barracks, Otto told me the weekend would be different. Saturday and Sunday were rest days. No work. The prisoners could sleep, play cards, attend religious services if they wanted, or participate in recreation activities the camp organized. I asked what kind of recreation. Otto grinned. Sometimes they let us swim. I thought he was joking. He was not. Saturday, June 19th, 2:30 in the afternoon. An American sergeant named Daniels walked through the POW compound announcing that 12 prisoners could volunteer for a swimming trip to Lake Geneva. Supervised activity, 2-hour duration, return by 5 o'clock. I volunteered immediately. I hadn't been swimming since I was a teenager in Bavaria, the Isar River on summer afternoons with my sister and friends, before everything changed, before the war. The idea of swimming in an American lake while being a prisoner of war seemed absurd, but Otto had said it was real, and I needed to know if this mercy extended even to something as unnecessary as swimming. Werner refused to volunteer. "I don't swim with the enemy," he said. His voice carried contempt. "For the Americans, for those of us who volunteered, for the weakness he believed we were showing." Otto volunteered. So did 9 others. We were loaded into a truck at 2:30. Hayes was one of the 3 guards, so was Sullivan, and a sergeant named Williams who I'd seen around camp but never spoken to. The truck drove for 20 minutes through pine forest. I sat on the wooden bench and watched palm trees pass through the canvas opening. Hayes sat across from me eating an orange, grinning, and then he said it. "We're going swimming." That's where this began. In the back of that truck, watching Hayes grin while juice ran down his chin, trying to understand what kind of country let its prisoners swim in lakes during a war that was consuming the world. The truck stopped. We climbed out, and I saw Lake Geneva for the first time. Clear water, maybe 300 yards across, sandy bottom visible near the shore, pine trees surrounding it on 3 sides. The water looked clean, inviting. Nothing like the muddy irrigation ditches we'd bathed in during the North Africa campaign. This was a real lake, the kind you'd take your family to on a Sunday afternoon. Hayes led us down to the water. "You can swim in your uniforms or swim in your underwear," he said. "Your choice." Most of the prisoners stripped down to their underwear. I kept my pants on but removed my shirt. The other guards, Williams and Sullivan, stood on the shore. Sullivan held his rifle. Williams looked relaxed. Sullivan looked like he was guarding something valuable and dangerous. I waded in up to my waist. The water was warm, like bath water almost. I stood there for a moment, feeling the bottom with my toes, and then I dove forward and swam. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this. The feeling of water, the weightlessness, the silence below the surface. I swam underwater for maybe 10 yards before coming up for air. When I surfaced, I saw the other prisoners splashing near the shore, Some of them were laughing, actual laughter. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard a German soldier laugh. Not since before Tunisia, maybe. Not since before the surrender. And then something impossible happened. Hayes waded into the water, not just wading to cool off. He dove forward and started swimming, actually swimming, out toward the center of the lake. Sergeant Williams followed. Within 5 minutes, 3 American guards were swimming alongside 12 German prisoners. Not swimming together exactly, but sharing the same water, the same space, the same moment of peace during a war that had already killed millions and would kill millions more before it ended. Sullivan stayed on the shore. He never entered the water, just stood there with his rifle slung over his shoulder watching. But he wasn't tense. He was just present, doing his job, making sure nobody tried to escape. Though where would we go? We were in the middle of Florida, wearing uniforms marked with PW, hundreds of miles from any neutral territory. Escape was theoretically possible, but practically suicide. I floated on my back and stared at the Florida sky. It was clearer than the North African sky, bluer, no dust, no smoke, just endless blue with a few white clouds drifting past. I thought about the last 3 years, joining the Wehrmacht in 1940, training in Poland, deployment to North Africa in early 42, 18 months of fighting across Libya and Tunisia, the constant fear, the constant hunger, the constant noise of artillery and aircraft and small arms fire, then capture, then the ship, then this, floating in a lake in Florida while American guards let me swim without chains or handcuffs or threats. Nothing made sense, but here I was, and for 2 hours the war disappeared, not forgotten, just distant, like something happening to other people in another world. At 4:15, Hayes called us out of the water. Time to return to camp. We dressed, climbed back into the truck, rode back to Camp Blanding in silence. I couldn't speak. I had nothing to say that would make sense of what had just happened. How do you explain to someone that your enemies let you swim, that they treated you like a human being instead of a threat, that for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon in June, you felt free, even though you were a prisoner? That night I wrote a letter to my mother. The letters were censored, so I couldn't write about military matters or camp locations or anything that might be useful to Germany. I could only write about general conditions and my health. I wrote that I was safe, that the Americans were treating me well, that I'd gone swimming that afternoon. I knew she wouldn't believe that last part. I barely believed it myself. But it had happened, and that meant something. What exactly I didn't know yet. But it meant something about America, about mercy, about the choice people make when they have power over others. The Americans had power over me, complete power. They could have done anything. Instead, they let me swim. Why would Americans follow the Geneva Convention when Germany wasn't? The answer would come later, and it would shake everything I thought I knew about my own country. Werner found me after lights out that night. I was lying on my cot, staring at the ceiling, still feeling the phantom sensation of water on my skin. He stood at the foot of my bunk, his shadow falling across me in the dim light from the corridor. His voice came low and hard. "You're being corrupted, Ernst. Softened. They're breaking you with kindness, and you don't even see it. When Germany wins, men like you will hang as collaborators." I sat up slowly. Werner's face was rigid in the darkness. Behind him, I could see other prisoners pretending to sleep, but I knew they were listening. Every word in that barracks mattered. Every conversation could shift the balance between cooperation and resistance. Germany isn't winning, Werner. I kept my voice steady. Look at the maps. Use your brain instead of your ideology. We're fighting on 3 fronts against enemies with unlimited industrial capacity. The mathematics don't work. This war is already over. We just haven't accepted it yet. His hand moved fast. I saw it coming but didn't move. Defeatist. Traitor. The words came with spittle. He was shaking now. With rage or fear, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. Otto swung his legs off his bunk. The movement was casual but deliberate. He was older than both of us, heavier with the kind of presence that comes from years of command. "Werner, go to your bunk. Ernst speaks truth, not treason. The only traitor here is the ideology that got us into this mess. Werner turned on him. You too. You've been here too long. They've already broken you. Otto stood. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. I've been broken by reality, Werner. By watching good men die for a cause that was lost before it started. By seeing what our leaders actually are instead of what we were told they were. The Americans didn't break me. The truth did. And if you had any sense left, you'd let it break you too. For a moment I thought Werner would throw a punch. His fists were clenched, his whole body coiled like a spring. But the guards were making their rounds. Footsteps in the corridor. Werner saw the shadow pass the window. He stepped back, looked at both of us with eyes full of something beyond hatred. Contempt, maybe, or grief for what he thought we'd become. This isn't over, he said. Then he walked back to his bunk. I lay back down. My heart was pounding. Otto returned to his cot without a word. The barracks settled into an uneasy silence. Outside, the Florida insects kept singing their strange songs, and I realized something that should have been obvious from the start. The real war here wasn't between Americans and Germans. It was between prisoners who could adapt to the truth and prisoners who'd rather die than abandon the lie. The swimming trips continued through the summer, once or twice a month depending on work schedules and guard availability. Always the same pattern: 12 prisoners, 3 guards, 2 hours at Lake Geneva or sometimes other nearby lakes. Return by evening. The guards always brought their rifles, but they never needed them. No prisoner ever attempted escape during those trips. Where would we go? We were in the middle of Florida, hundreds of miles from any neutral territory, wearing uniforms marked with large PW letters. Escape was suicide, and most of us didn't want to escape anyway. The conditions at Camp Blanding were better than the conditions we'd experienced in the Wehrmacht during the final months of the North Africa campaign. Better food, better shelter, no combat, no officers screaming orders, no constant threat of death from artillery or airstrikes or armored assaults. Some prisoners called it a golden cage, comfortable confinement. Otto called it something else. He called it a chance to survive. The alternative was returning to Germany, which by mid-1943 was being bombed daily by Allied aircraft. The alternative was being sent to the Eastern Front, which was consuming entire German armies in battles that made North Africa look like a training exercise. The alternative was death. Probable death. Almost certain death. So I picked oranges, attended swimming trips when I could, played chess with Otto in the barracks in the evenings, and waited for the war to end. The work in the citrus groves continued through June and July. I became efficient at picking. By my 3rd week I could fill my 30 boxes by 3 in the afternoon. That gave me 2 hours of rest before the truck returned to camp. I spent that time sitting under the oak tree, eating oranges until I was sick of them, watching the American guards. The guards changed periodically. Some were friendly like Hayes, some were indifferent, none were cruel. I noticed that many of them were older men, too old for combat duty, or younger men who'd been classified as unfit for overseas deployment due to injuries or medical conditions. These men had drawn garrison duty, supervising prisoners in Florida instead of fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Some of them seemed embarrassed by this assignment. They wanted to be in combat, proving themselves, earning the respect that came from actual fighting. But I thought they'd drawn the better assignment. They were alive. They'd go home when the war ended. That mattered more than medals or glory or the approval of men who'd never understand what combat actually meant. Sullivan remained distant through June and most of July. He worked our detail 3 days a week, never spoke to prisoners, never smiled, just watched with those hard eyes. I wondered what had happened to him, what had carved that grief into his face. Hayes told me eventually. During a lunch break in late July, while we sat under the oak tree smoking cigarettes, Sullivan's brother died at Kasserine Pass, February this year, 21 years old, killed by German 88mm artillery, the same guns my unit had used in Tunisia. Hayes said it matter-of-factly while eating an orange. Said Sullivan had volunteered for combat duty after that. Wanted revenge. But he'd broken his hand in training. Badly. The kind of break that never heals right. So they assigned him to guard duty instead. And now he spends his days watching the same kind of men who killed his brother swim in Florida lakes. I looked across at Sullivan. He was sitting alone 20 feet away, cleaning his rifle. I felt something shift inside me. Not guilt exactly. I hadn't fired the gun that killed his brother, but I'd worn the same uniform as the men who had. I'd served the same cause, and in Sullivan's eyes that made me complicit, made me responsible, made me someone who deserved his hatred. But he didn't act on it. That was the thing I couldn't understand. He had every reason to make my life miserable, to find small ways to punish me within the rules, to make me feel his grief. But he didn't. He just did his job, professionally, correctly, like a man who'd decided that revenge wasn't worth the cost. August brought changes. The citrus harvest was ending. Patterson, the foreman, told us we'd be reassigned to other labor projects. Some prisoners would go to logging camps in northern Florida. Others would work construction on military facilities. My group was sent to a plant being built near Winter Haven, the Minute Maid processing plant. It would produce frozen concentrated orange juice. New technology the military wanted for supplying troops overseas. The work was different, harder. We weren't picking fruit anymore. We were doing construction, pouring concrete, laying bricks, installing plumbing and electrical systems. I had no construction experience. None of us did. We were soldiers, not builders. But the American civilian contractors supervising the project were patient. They demonstrated each task, corrected mistakes without anger, paid us the same 80 cents per day in camp script. I learned fast. How to mix concrete to the right consistency, how to lay bricks so they'd bear weight properly, how to run copper pipe without kinks or leaks. The work was satisfying in a way combat had never been. You could see what you'd accomplished at the end of each day. A wall that hadn't existed in the morning. A floor that was level and smooth. Something built instead of destroyed. Patterson visited the site in late August, watched me work for an hour without saying anything. Then he pulled me aside during the lunch break. "You're good at this, Ernst. Natural talent. Natural. You should do construction after the war. Real money in it. Honest work." I didn't know what to say. The idea of a future beyond the war seemed impossible, like planning what you'd do after death. But Patterson was serious. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself yet. The possibility of a life after all this ended. By September, I'd saved $60 in camp script. I spent it at the canteen on cigarettes, candy bars, and writing paper. The canteen also sold Coca-Cola. I tried it once. It tasted like medicine to me. Too sweet, too syrupy. I couldn't understand the appeal. But the other prisoners loved it. They bought it by the case, drank it while playing cards in the barracks. The taste of America, they called it. Otto said it tasted like optimism, like a country that had never known real hardship. I thought that was probably true. The news from Europe filtered into camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts the guards allowed us to access in the recreation hall. By September 1943, Italy had surrendered. Mussolini had been overthrown. The new Italian government had switched sides. German forces in Italy were now fighting alone against American and British troops pushing north from Sicily. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing after the disaster at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of vehicles destroyed, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and Germany had lost, decisively. The Wehrmacht was retreating, not in disorder yet, but retreating nonetheless. Germany was losing, not quickly, but inevitably. I understood this before most of the other prisoners admitted it. I'd studied the maps, calculated the distances, counted the divisions. Germany could not win a war on 3 fronts against enemies with superior numbers and superior industrial capacity. The only question was how long the war would continue and how many more men would die before Germany accepted defeat. I hoped the end would come before I was repatriated. Being a prisoner in Florida was preferable to being a soldier in Berlin when the Red Army arrived. The swimming trips stopped in October. The weather turned cooler, though cooler in Florida meant temperatures in the 70s instead of the 90s. The guards said the lakes were too cold for swimming. I didn't think 70 degrees was too cold, but I didn't argue. The trips had been a privilege, not a right. Privileges could be revoked without explanation. Instead, the camp organized other recreation activities: soccer games between barracks, chess tournaments, film screenings in the recreation hall. The films were American movies, mostly westerns and musicals, with German subtitles added by the camp administration. I watched a film called Stagecoach. It starred an actor named John Wayne. I'd never heard of him. The film was about cowboys and Indians and a stagecoach being chased across a desert. I thought it was ridiculous, but entertaining. The other prisoners loved it. They talked about John Wayne for weeks afterward, imitated his walk, his way of speaking, turned him into a kind of mythical figure, the American cowboy, free and independent and afraid of nothing. It was propaganda of a sort, but gentler than the propaganda we'd grown up with. It didn't tell you what to think, it just showed you a version of America and let you decide if you wanted to believe in it. One evening after a soccer game in late October, Sullivan approached me. It was the first time he'd come near me voluntarily. I was sitting on a bench near the field, unlacing my shoes. He stood a few feet away, not quite looking at me. "You play well," he said. "Where'd you learn?" The question surprised me so much I almost didn't answer. "Munich," I finally said. "Street football as a boy, before the war." Sullivan nodded. "My brother played." "Before—" He trailed off. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "I'm sorry for your brother," I said. The words felt inadequate, meaningless. "How do you apologize for a war? For artillery shells fired by men you never met wearing uniforms like yours?" Sullivan looked at me then, really looked at me. His eyes weren't hard anymore, just tired. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Then he walked away. That moment stayed with me. 5 sentences, maybe 30 seconds of conversation. But it changed something. Sullivan had chosen to see me as a person instead of a symbol, and I'd chosen to acknowledge his grief instead of defending myself. Neither of us had forgiven anything, but we'd recognized each other's humanity. And in the middle of a war designed to strip humanity away, that felt like a kind of miracle. The food remained good throughout 1943 and into early 1944. Beef, chicken, potatoes, bread, vegetables, canned fruit, coffee. The same rations American troops received. We gained weight, all of us. I'd weighed 140 pounds when I arrived at Camp Blanding in June 1943. By January 1944, I weighed 162 pounds. The difference was visible. In my face, my arms, my posture. I was no longer the malnourished soldier who'd surrendered in Tunisia. I was healthier now than I'd been in 3 years. Otto joked that the Americans were fattening us like pigs, preparing us for slaughter maybe. But he didn't believe that. Neither did I. The Americans followed their rules because their rules mattered to them, not because of external pressure, not because anyone was watching, but because their system said prisoners deserved dignity, and they'd internalized that principle so deeply they couldn't abandon it, even when it would have been easier. That was the thing about America I was beginning to understand. It wasn't perfect. It had flaws and contradictions and failures, but it had rules it actually believed in. And it followed those rules even when following them was inconvenient or costly or seemed naive. The Germans had rules too, plenty of rules, but our rules served power. They existed to maintain order and hierarchy and control. American rules seemed to serve something else, some idea of fairness or equality or human worth that existed independent of power. I didn't have the language for this yet, couldn't articulate what I was seeing, but I felt it. In the beef stew and the swimming trips, and the patience of civilian contractors teaching me skills I'd use after the war. In Hayes offering cigarettes, and Patterson talking about my future, and even Sullivan choosing not to hate me, despite having every reason to. December brought news from home, a letter from my mother. 2 months delayed. The paper was thin, her handwriting shaky. I read it sitting on my cot while other prisoners played cards nearby. My father was dead, killed in an air raid on Hamburg in October. The apartment building had taken a direct hit. He'd been in the basement shelter. It hadn't mattered. The entire structure had collapsed. My mother had been at work in a factory making uniforms. She'd come home to rubble. My younger brother Franz was on the Eastern Front. No recent word. The last letter she'd received was from August. He'd been near Smolensk, in good health, missing home. That was all she knew. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my footlocker. I lay back on my cot and stared at the ceiling, trying to feel something. Grief, rage, anything. But I just felt numb. Otto noticed. He always noticed. He sat on the edge of my bunk without speaking, just present. After maybe 10 minutes, I told him, "My father's dead. My brother's probably dead too. And I'm here eating beef stew and playing chess." Otto didn't offer platitudes, didn't tell me it would be okay, or that I'd feel better eventually. He just said, "You're alive." That's not something to apologize for. Your father would want you to stay alive. Your mother needs you to stay alive. So stay alive. Honor them that way. I couldn't speak, just nodded. Otto gripped my shoulder once hard, then returned to his bunk. The other prisoners gave me space that night. No one spoke to me. No one asked questions. They just let me sit with my grief in silence. That night I understood something I should have known all along. Survivor's guilt is a kind of poison. It eats you from the inside, makes you feel like you don't deserve the good things that happen to you, makes you punish yourself for being fortunate when others suffered. I'd been carrying that poison since Tunisia, since the moment I dropped my rifle and raised my hands while men around me chose to fight and die. But Otto was right. Being alive wasn't a sin. It was a responsibility. My father was dead. My brother was probably dead. My mother was alone in a ruined city. And I was the only one who could go back to her when this ended. The only one who could help her rebuild. The only family she had left. So I had to survive, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. I had to stay human through all of this, so that when I finally went home, I'd be someone worth coming home to. Someone who could build instead of destroy. Someone who remembered what mercy looked like and could pass that knowledge forward. The Americans were teaching me that. Not through words, through actions. Through beef stew and swimming trips and patient instruction on how to lay bricks properly. They were showing me that even in war, even between enemies, humanity could survive if people chose to preserve it. The work at the Minute Maid plant continued through winter and into spring of '44. I became skilled at plumbing installation. Patterson noticed, offered me a lead position on a crew of 5 prisoners. The pay was the same, but the responsibility felt different. I was building something, creating instead of destroying. On June 6, 1944, the world changed. The Recreation Hall radio broadcast news of the Normandy invasion. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. The liberation of Europe had begun. The prisoners gathered around the radio in silence. Werner stood in the back, his face like stone. "Germany will throw them back into the sea," he said. But his voice carried less certainty now, more desperation. No one responded. We all knew the truth. The maps told the story. The numbers didn't lie. This was the beginning of the end. Otto caught my eye across the room. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Within a year, this would be over. Maybe sooner. Sullivan stood near the doorway. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw him smile. Just a small one, but real. His war was ending. He'd survived. Soon he could go home. The swimming trips resumed in late June. Summer heat had returned to Florida. The lakes were warm again. I volunteered for every trip I could, not because I loved swimming particularly, but because those 2 hours in the water felt like the only truly free moments I had, the only time when the weight of everything lifted even briefly. I floated on my back one afternoon in July and thought about the future. Germany would fall, probably by next spring. Then what? Would they send us home immediately, or keep us here while they sorted through the rubble of Europe? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. When I went back, I would build. I would use the skills Patterson had taught me. I would help reconstruct what we'd destroyed. That would be my penance, my way of honoring my father's memory and my mother's suffering. The months passed, summer to fall, fall to winter. The news from Europe grew steadily worse for Germany. The Red Army pushing from the east, Americans and British from the west, cities falling one by one, the Reich shrinking like a dying star. In April of 45, Werner finally broke completely. News had reached camp about the assassination attempt on Hitler the previous July. The conspirators executed, thousands arrested, a massive purge. Werner went wild, started screaming about traitors, about how Germany would have won if not for the cowards and backstabbers. He turned on Otto. "You knew about this," he shouted. "You and your kind wanted us to lose. You're all traitors who deserve to hang." He swung a mess tin at Otto's head. Connected. Otto went down hard, blood streaming from a cut above his ear. I jumped between them. Werner came at me. Guards rushed in, pulled him off, dragged him away while he screamed about loyalty and destiny and the final victory that would never come. I helped Otto to his feet. The cut wasn't deep, but it bled heavily. "You all right?" I asked. Otto touched his head, winced. "Werner's gone," he said. "The ideology ate everything else. There's nothing left but rage." Werner spent 2 weeks in isolation. When he returned, something fundamental had died in him. He sat on his bunk for hours, staring at nothing, lips moving in silent arguments with ghosts. I never spoke to him again. Most prisoners gave him space. He'd chosen his path. Now he had to walk it alone. Otto and I grew closer after that. Real friendship forged in shared understanding. We played chess most evenings, talked about the future, simple plans, find our families, rebuild, live quiet lives. Nothing grand, nothing heroic, just survival and reconstruction. May 8th, 1945. The loudspeakers crackled at 11 in the morning. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The Americans cheered. They hugged each other. Some cried. They could go home now, back to their families and farms and lives that had been interrupted by war. We prisoners sat in silence. It was over. We'd lost. Everything we'd been told about inevitable victory had been lies. We'd lost completely, totally, without qualification. But we'd survived, and in the camps of Florida, far from the ruins of Europe, that felt like the only victory that mattered. I didn't know it then, but the hardest truth was just beginning. A truth that would make me question whether I deserved any of the mercy I'd been shown. 3 days after the war ended, everything changed. Colonel Hayes called an assembly, all prisoners required. We stood in formation in the main yard while he climbed onto a platform. His face looked different. The casual warmth that had characterized his command was gone. He looked tired, angry, disgusted. "Gentlemen," he said, and something bitter edged that word. "News has reached the United States about conditions in German concentration camps. Photographs have been published, film footage shown in cinemas. The American public has seen what was done at Bergen-Belsen-Dachau, Auschwitz." My stomach dropped. We'd heard rumors, whispers about camps in Poland, things that weren't supposed to be discussed. But rumors were easy to dismiss as enemy propaganda. "Congress has demanded that German prisoners receive reduced rations as punishment," Hayes continued. "I disagreed with this policy. I argued against it. But I have orders. Your meals will be smaller. You'll still receive Geneva Convention minimums. Work continues. You'll still be paid. But Americans can no longer stomach feeding you the same rations as our troops, while photographs show what Germany did to its prisoners." He looked at us. Really looked at us. "I don't hold each of you personally responsible for those camps. But I can't ignore them either. What was done in your nation's name is beyond comprehension. The rations will be reduced, that's all. He stepped down. Guards began posting newspapers on bulletin boards. I didn't want to look, but I had to know. The New York Times, May 7th edition. The photograph on the front page stopped my heart. Bodies. Piles of bodies. Not soldiers, civilians. Skeletal, naked, stacked like cordwood. The caption said, Bergen-Belsen. British forces had liberated the camp, tens of thousands dead. I turned the page. More photographs. Survivors who looked like walking corpses. Children with hollow eyes. Gas chamber doors. Ovens. Testimonies describing the systematic murder of millions. I felt my knees weaken. Sat on the ground. This couldn't be real. Had to be propaganda. Exaggeration. But the photographs were too detailed. Too numerous. Too real. Werner walked past. Looked at the newspaper. His face twisted. Lies, he said. Allied propaganda to justify what they're doing to Germany. He walked away, repeating it. Lies. 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 But I knew they weren't lies. I'd heard the rumours. We'd all heard them. Trains going east. People disappearing. Things soldiers weren't supposed to discuss. I'd told myself they were exaggerations. That maybe some bad things happened, but not this. Not industrial murder, not millions. I'd been wrong. And my wrongness made me complicit. I returned to the barracks, sat on my bunk, stared at the photograph I'd kept for 2 years. Lake Geneva, 12 prisoners smiling. It felt obscene now. I'd been swimming while they died, eating beef stew while they starved, laughing while they were gassed. Otto sat beside me. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said something that broke what was left inside me. I knew. I looked at him. What I knew. Not details. But I knew something evil was happening. I was stationed near Dachau in 38, before the war. I saw things. Trucks at night. Smoke. Heard screams. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. I was just a soldier, just following orders. He looked at his hands. But that's a lie, isn't it? We're all responsible. Everyone who wore the uniform, everyone who heard rumors and didn't ask questions, everyone who chose comfort over truth. I stared at the photograph. Then why did they treat us with mercy? We didn't deserve it. Otto was quiet. Maybe that's the point. Mercy isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to preserve humanity even when the other side has abandoned it. The Americans could have treated us the way we treated prisoners, but they didn't. They chose something different. The rations were reduced the next day, smaller portions, less meat, more bread and potatoes, still adequate, still more than millions in Europe were getting. But the reduction wasn't about food. It was about distance. The Americans needed separation from what they'd been doing. The guards became colder. Hayes still spoke to me, but the warmth was gone. Sullivan returned to silence. The swimming trips never resumed. Recreation continued, but the atmosphere was different. Professional. Correct. Cold. I understood. How could they look at us the same after seeing those photographs? We wore the same uniform as the men who'd run those camps. We served the same regime. Complicit by association. I stopped eating bacon. Couldn't stomach it. Every Sunday when they served it, I remembered the photographs. The skeletal bodies. I couldn't eat. The repatriation process began in late 45 but moved slowly. Thousands of prisoners. Limited shipping. We waited through fall and winter. Otto received word in February that his family in Hamburg had survived. His wife and daughters were alive. Working in a factory. Living in a basement. But alive. He wept when he got the letter. I'd received nothing from Munich. No word since that letter about my father's death. My mother was probably dead too. But I wouldn't know until I returned. March 12th, 1946. My name appeared on the repatriation list. 300 prisoners loaded onto buses, driven to Jacksonville. I'd been in Florida nearly 3 years. At the dock, Hayes appeared. I hadn't seen him in weeks. He'd been transferred, but he came that morning. Found me in the crowd. Ernst, he said. Just my name. We stood there, Two men who'd been enemies, who'd shared cigarettes and swimming holes and something neither of us had words for. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small American flag, maybe 6 inches by 4, the kind children wave at parades. He pressed it into my hand. "Keep it. Remember that Americans can be decent, even to enemies." I took the flag. Couldn't speak. Hayes extended his hand. We shook. "Good luck, Ernst. I hope you find your family." "Thank you," I managed. "For everything." He nodded, turned, disappeared into the crowd. I never saw him again. I hid the flag in my jacket and boarded the ship. 14 days crossing the Atlantic. I spent most of it on deck staring at waves, thinking about 4 years. I'd left Germany in 42 believing in victory. I was returning in 46 carrying a photograph and an American flag, having learned that the enemy showed more mercy than my own leaders. Otto stood beside me one afternoon. "What will you do?" "Find my mother. Rebuild. Live." "Simple plan," Otto said. "Best kind." We docked at Cherbourg on March 26th. French authorities processed us, loaded us onto trains heading east. I watched through windows as we crossed France. The destruction was everywhere. Ruined towns, burned tanks, bomb craters, refugees walking with everything they owned in bundles. "This is what war actually looks like," Otto said. "Not swimming pools. This." We crossed into Germany on April 1st. The destruction intensified. Every city damaged, some completely destroyed, just rubble and broken walls. We reached Munich on April 3rd. I stepped off the train into a city I didn't recognize. My city, now unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods gone, streets filled with ghosts, women digging through rubble, children begging, former soldiers searching for families. I spent 2 days searching for my mother, asked neighbors, checked refugee lists. On the 3rd day, an old woman told me my mother was alive, living in a basement 3 blocks from where our house had stood. I found the building, walked down concrete steps, knocked. My mother answered, stared at me. Didn't recognize me at first. I'd gained weight in America, looked healthy. She was 52 but looked 70, skeletal, grey, worn to nothing. "Mutter," I said. "It's me, Ernst." Her legs gave out. I caught her, held her while she sobbed. "You're alive, you're alive." She kept repeating it. "I'm home," I said. We sat in that basement and she told me everything. Father dead in 43, France killed on the Eastern Front in January 45. She'd survived by working in a factory until it was bombed, then whatever work she could find, trading valuables for food, living day to day. I didn't tell her about Florida, about swimming or beef stew or bacon. It felt obscene, so I just held her and said I was home, that we'd rebuild, that we'd survive together. In May, a letter from Otto arrived. He'd found his family in Hamburg, everyone alive. He'd found construction work, rebuilding brick by brick. The letter ended. "We were lucky, Ernst. We survived because Americans fed us. Remember that." I did remember. Every day. I found work using Florida skills, construction, plumbing, electrical. The city needed everything rebuilt. I worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. The pay was minimal, but enough for black market food. Munich would take decades to restore. I kept 2 things from captivity. The photograph, the flag. Never showed them to anyone, just kept them in a drawer. Sometimes, late at night, I'd take them out and look at them, try to understand what they meant. Years passed. I married in 49. Anna, a war widow. We had 3 children. Greta in 51, Klaus in 53. Helga in 56. I worked as a foreman. Eventually opened a small contracting business in 62. Modest success. Enough to provide. Enough to rebuild something. I never returned to America. Couldn't afford it. Didn't want to disturb the memory. Florida existed in my mind as something dreamlike. Better to leave it perfect and untouchable. One afternoon in 1965, Klaus found the photograph in my desk. He was 12, curious about everything. "Papa, who are these men? Why are they smiling?" I'd never talked about Florida with my children. But Klaus was looking at me with honest eyes. "That's me," I said. "In America. During the war. I was a prisoner. Did they hurt you?" "No. They treated us well. Better than we deserved." Why, I pulled out the small flag, showed both items. These remind me that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose kindness. When you have power over someone, you choose how to use it. The Americans had power over me. They chose mercy. Klaus held the photograph carefully. "You're smiling." "Yes." "Were you happy?" "Not happy. Grateful. Confused. Trying to understand how enemies could be kind. Your generation won't understand this. But it mattered. It changed how I see the world." Klaus never forgot that conversation. Years later, he'd tell me it shaped how he thought about power and responsibility. I died in 1987. Heart attack. Quick. Painless. 68 years old. My family around me. I'd lived a full life. Built something from ruins. Raised children who raised children. The photograph and flag were found in my desk after I died. Klaus kept them. In 2005, he traveled to Florida with his family. By then, a professor in Munich. He visited the Camp Blanding Museum, saw displays about German POWs, read accounts similar to mine. The museum director mentioned they were trying to locate photographs from the POW era. Klaus donated mine. It now hangs in the museum. German POWs at Lake Geneva, June 1943. The placard reads, "Even in war, humanity can survive when people choose to preserve it." Sometimes visitors stop and look. Most walk past. It looks like any group photograph from the 40s. Men standing together, wet, smiling. But it's more than that. It's evidence. Proof that mercy is possible even between enemies. That humanity can survive even the worst evil if people choose to preserve it. If this story moved, you hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're sharing forgotten stories like this every single day. Real history, real people, real moments of humanity in impossible circumstances. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Did someone in your family serve during World War II? Did they ever speak about German prisoners? Share their story below. Let's honor the greatest generation together by keeping these memories alive. Ernst Hoffmann lived until 1987, carrying the lesson of Lake Geneva forward. The Americans chose mercy when they could have chosen revenge. They followed their rules when breaking them would have been easier. They preserved his humanity when he'd served a regime that had abandoned humanity completely. That choice echoes still, in a photograph in a Munich museum, in the memory of a son who learned kindness from his father, in every person who hears this story and decides to preserve humanity in their own way. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for making sure stories like Ernst's are never forgotten.